Welcome again to Arctic Frontiers 2025 Beyond Borders. We're here again at the Arctic Frontiers Offstage studio on the 11th floor of The Edge in Tromsø. We just had our second big picture session at this year's Arctic Frontiers conference, talking about strategies for regional capacity building. And to discuss this topic, I have three new guests with me, so thank you very much for all of you for joining me. On my opposite, I have Betty Bruns, the Secretary General of the Arctic Mayors Forum. To my left, to your right, it's Niels Christian Sørheim Nielsen. Your name is too long always. The Director of the North Norway office, regional office in Brussels. And to my right, to your left then, I have Diane Hirschberg, who is the Director of the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Alaska in Anchorage. Welcome to all of you. Strategies for regional capacity building. Patty, what does that mean?
What does that mean? Good words. I understand all of them individually. What do they mean together? I think within the Arctic region, we really need to focus on cooperation and collaboration. And to quote Mayor Mary Louise Ronmark from this session, it's not only about cooperation, but co-creation, which I thought was a really eloquent way of sort of driving home the fact that regional strategies, by definition, mean that we have to be working across borders and across communities, across academia, across business. So from an Arctic Mayors Forum perspective, that means making sure that our network of communities from across the Arctic has the capacity and the strength to ensure that the voices of the people living in the Arctic who call it home by choice or by birth actually have their voices heard and put into those regional strategies.
All right, we'll come back to how that works on a practical level.
Sure.
With voices being heard or not heard. Because I want to come back to you. You work for the regional office of North Norway, the region of North Norway, in Brussels, to lobby, to present, to give policymakers down south in Brussels, in a complex policy setting, an idea of what the Arctic and North Norway is. Like for you, strategy about regional capacity building. What does that mean in your day-to-day job?
Well, of course, one thing is competence about what the Arctic is, and you could say the opportunities, the lives we are living, the lives we want to live, and also not being overrun by decision makers in more central parts of the world. And of course, they have to know the big interest drivers in you could say in Europe when it comes to the Arctic is, you could say, security policy, geopolitics on one side, it's environment and climate on the other, while we comes from the Arctic want to develop sustainable societies and have the ability to do that. And then you are talking about, you could say, empowering local communities, the regions and things like that. Mm-hmm. And that's much of my job, to try to empower the regions I work for.
Mm-hmm. So again, it's similar, to give certain communities, certain people a certain voice in a complex policy setting. Mm-hmm. Diane, you work very much with research education, and in this session we heard a lot about the need for more research in general, and of course also involving young people who are the very center of education to some extent, to give them also a certain voice, or a better, a more clearer voice in Arctic policymaking. So from your understanding, from your background, how do you see strategies for regional capacity building in a complex geographical setting that is the Arctic?
Well, I really think about what are the skills and what is the knowledge that people need in order to enact their own self-determined vision of sustainable development. And so in some cases, that's a very concrete focus on education in the institutional sense. Coming to the university for an engineering degree. We talked about that in an earlier learning about policy making in a concrete way. But there's also the side of capacity building that is building on the knowledge that is held by the people from the land. So the elders who have wisdom, but in some cases we're not figuring out how best to help them share that with the next generation. When we see youth on the stage, one of the things I really appreciate in Alaska is we tend to bring youth and elders together. And I think some of that happens here, but it's not as intentional with elders. There's olders here, but not necessarily elders. It's a different strategy in terms of organizing those conversations. Another piece, though, which is happening here and is really critical, is the community to community knowledge sharing, because the understanding in Tromsø about what the role of education can be in building the economic well-being of a place and the health well-being. I always share with people what I've learned about how many years are we up to? 50, 60 years of health data, because this is a community that collectively decided to participate in this multi-decade panel. There's enormous amounts of knowledge that get developed by communities that share those values, that this is important. And then the rest of us across the Arctic can learn from that, even if what we're trying to then do is say, so how do we do that given our culture and our context?
What we often hear at this conference is that, of course, decisions are made somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So if we understand that, the complexity of a region, we understand the shared values, what we can learn from each other, how do we communicate this shared understanding to places where decisions are made, like in Brussels, or better in your job as from the Mayor's Forum perspective, where you bring together Arctic regions that are essential part of Arctic governance, but then quite some decisions are not made up here, How do you bring that together in your day-to-day work, in a practical work? Like, we understand their shared values, but what we heard today is challenges are common, solutions are different.
Mm-hmm.
How do you communicate that to policymakers that don't have maybe that much time to listen?
Sure. Well, I think we have to keep trying, right? I think that's one of the things about working in the Arctic, is that we're all very, we have a lot of perseverance. But there are decisions that are made at municipal levels. And, there are jurisdictional questions here. But when we're talking about those intertwined aspects of society, how do we make those voices known? Well, we support organizations like Arctic Mayors Forum. We figure out how we are going to work with Nils in Brussels, and with Diane in Anchorage, and with the Nordic Council of Ministers, with the EU. One example, tonight we're signing an MOU with the Standing Committee of Arctic Parliamentarians. So we have this symbolic handshake with them to say that we are going to work together to figure out how the people that vote for them in their constituencies, we're going to help them make sure that those voices and those themes are taken yet in another way to those national parliaments, and then into the international sphere. So it is about giving places and spaces and listening, and just coming together and driving home those messages. And I would also argue having clear idea about what those messages are. And that's why convening spaces like Arctic Frontiers and other Arctic conferences are really important, because we kind of get to coalesce our ideas and have conversations with our peers.
Do policymakers listen enough? Do we have the clearest messages so that they understand what we try to communicate, or what is lacking if we don't?
I think that's a really loaded question. Yes, some do. Yes, and no, others don't. And maybe the magic sauce here is figuring out how to quickly figure out who listens and who doesn't, and put your energy into the right basket. I would also say that we need to be a little bit more forthcoming, and a little bit a little bit stronger in our messaging and say what needs to be said without sugarcoating it, because in the Arctic we are a little bit of an echo chamber, right? We know, but how do we message those things outside of the Arctic so that other people understand them while also keeping our ears open to what's going on in the outside world?
News. I look to you here now. Like, how do you communicate that complexity the Arctic is to an audience that only peripherally listens or knows about the Arctic? Like in your
We work by example, you could say. Very often we invite people from the high north down to Brussels to tell people in Brussels how excellent they are, what kind of developments we are into, about our universities, academic institutions, our innovations, etc., etc. So that's one thing, and we also bring with us people from the Brussels bubble up here on a study trip. We have been on for several years. We have had people with us for a week-long study trip. Now it's more, you could say, 2 or 3 people we bring up here and take them on a 1 day or 2 or 3 days study trip. But we have been doing this for many years, and we were also involved, for example, in the Arctic Friendship Group in the European Parliament, and speak with them regularly on different topics. Yeah.
So it's about actively engaging them and reaching out to them. How is that happening in Alaska?
Well, I think there's 2 pieces to this. One is, again, I'm faculty in a Master of Public Policy program, and I teach an Arctic policy class, and I teach my students to write 2-page policy memos where they're actually aimed at policymakers. And in fact, we're now even switching up our final exercise that we're going to do a critique of the Office of Research in the that Congress has. They have a document they use to brief policymakers, and it's really not good. So we're just going to take it on. We're going to have our students critique it and share that. So part of it is training people in the Arctic, and it's a very non-Indigenous way, of course, of communicating, but Congress is its own beast, and you have to know how to negotiate that, or the state capitol. But at the same time, speaking of Arctic parliamentarians, Senator Lisa Murkowski has been phenomenal at bringing up members of Congress and cabinet members regardless of the administration. She brought up people from the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration. And there is something about being out on the land and seeing the place. And frankly, Alaska, people know of it as a tourist destination, so it's not that hard to get them up there. It's when they get out to some of our more remote communities and they see places where people don't have running water, and they realize that microgrids, there isn't power, there aren't paved roads, there are not flush toilets, and we've had some significant gains from that. Really, that hands-on, but that can be tough. And of course, right now we're in a situation where Senator Murkowski probably is not going to get cooperation from the administration this time around. So whether it's our other senator or whether we need to be thinking more creatively, again, about working with the mayors, working with members of Congress and other states who recognize, in particular because of geopolitical security and climate change, that Alaska is an important strategic asset that they should understand. If we gets them up there, I don't care what language we use, because once you're there and you see people, that's the key is we need to get them there, and then they can meet the people, and the people are engaging and dynamic and intriguing, and that helps a lot.
But in the session today, we heard that, politics first is not entertainment, and that we lack people sometimes to be engaged in politics, you know. So what could be a creative way? It's not an Arctic question, obviously, but could be a creative way to engage more young people? As we talk about education, Betty, could be something like, I wouldn't say the Arctic Mayors Forum per se, but something where you really try to bring together the local level and more the national level. How could we think more creatively of involving particularly young people? This was a second topic that has been raised today in this session, you know.
Sure, and I think that having, you know, the Arctic Youth Conference on the margins of or before Arctic Frontiers has really put a spotlight on this. I think that we need to listen to young people. That's what we're hearing. We need to build trust. We need to make promises that we can keep. And something that Cecilia said today actually kind of resonated with me, maybe as a parent, but sort of like, if we have to listen, and if we disagree, we have to tell them why we disagree, right? So it's about that sharing of knowledge between generations, between knowledge systems. I do think there are some practical things that we can do. And it was mentioned by one of the emerging leaders, and that's mentorships. So making sure, and this elders or olders and youngsters or younger people, is actually providing mentorship opportunities to young people in communities who may not actually see themselves as leaders, but may need that encouragement or a redefinition of what a leader is, so that we actually enable young people to have the tools that they need. So I think that's something very practical that we can do. But yeah, we have a challenge on our hands. It's very difficult to get young people involved in politics at the local level. People aren't signing up, and part of that has to do with issues people become issue driven. So it's, I'm all about raising the drinking age, right? So then you go down your TikTok or your Instagram rabbit hole and you get into this echo chamber about why you're right about something. So again, I think as olders, we need to really teach those principles of democracy right from babies up through to when these young people are voting and are actually able to act as leaders, as young leaders from when they're in school.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
you well summarized, I think, three core topics or core phrases I heard. Honesty on the one hand, mentorship, you know, and then this long-term thinking, you know. I'm looking at Niels here again, you know. I mean, you work with policymakers, both on the local level in Northern Norway, but also on the European Union level. I mean, honesty, okay, politics and honesty, we can debate about that. But the mentorship idea, you know, is that something that would resonate with people both in Northern Norway as well as in Brussels, where you say, okay, could we create some kind of mentorship program where people from the north travel to Brussels, meet leaders that are developing broader European Union policies that have an effect on the Arctic?
Out from a creativity perspective, that could be exciting to try out something like that. I know that also the Arctic mayors have that kind of you could say, I don't know, a mentorship
Program, yeah, it's a program, yeah.
And a lot of, you could say, experienced people is involved, and whether it would work when it comes to the Arctic. The main challenge when it comes to the Arctic is to attract, you could say, interest for these topics among politicians in general. This could be on a national level, but in particular, it is an issue in the EU because, as I said, it's security policy on one hand and environment and climate on the other, and what the rest is you could say filled with myths. So it's ice, it's ice cold, it's no people living there, it's perhaps a penguin, as someone have said. But it is a long way to walk to attract, you could say, the real interest when it comes to the Arctic, except from these two big interest drivers. I think we need some creativity, and we might need some young people who can, you could say, be on a training camp, help us find new solution and not think that much within the box, do things exactly the same as we always have done, and ask this why is so important. So
I'm going to jump in and just say shout out actually to Kristen Haverla and AMAP. They just took this group of 10 young people from across the Arctic on a ski trip across Finnmark in the dead of January. And I was speaking with the executive secretary, Rolf, today, and he said that one of the young participants had never traveled, and he said it was like watching a flower blossom, you know, to be connected to the land and to have that experience. And that those are creative solutions, right? But it takes energy from us as well to instill that hope, I think.
Oh yeah.
No, I think it takes time, no?
It
I mean,
does.
Are we impatient? Probably sometimes too impatient.
I don't know if we're too impatient, because I do think that there are a lot of particularly young people who are ripe for this, whether they are coming from the south or from elsewhere in the north. There's a lot of really interesting, innovative programs that are connecting youth, which is exciting, but they are expensive. And it's a bit tough in terms of, you know, you've got to find the mentors who have the time and the ability to engage in that. I heard in one of the sessions, I think it was the first part of this afternoon, where they were talking about the creative economy. That's something that we're looking at quite a bit in Alaska, is understanding that the creative economy is part of what attracts young people to a place. When we look at, even if there's a good job, is there affordable housing, but is there a place where somebody feels like they can have a social life? And part of the equation that wasn't discussed here that we've been looking at is documenting the actual economic impact of the creative economy on the place. So whether it's a pub that finds that when they have live music, they've got more people there for longer, eating and drinking more, or whether it's the Faroe Islands starting destination concerts. Certainly Iceland has really done destination concerts. We're trying to figure out, we have a music festival where people camp, and it's like, that's kind of fun, but what that does is it means there's no hotels and no restaurants that are getting income from this. Why aren't we having destination music festivals in Anchorage as well as down on the Kenai? So beginning to look at those where young people can see a social environment that's going to be attractive to bring many more young people up. Because if we get them up there for a concert and they look around and they see how beautiful the place is and how welcoming it is, they may come for a longer stay.
For the very last question, I mean, I want to go back to, we heard about, you know, we know that there are many different Arctics in the Arctic. You know, you said the Arctic is often full of myth, you know. We heard in today's session, let me look it up how exactly it said, challenges are common, solutions are different, you know. So is it sometimes, are we on the wrong path if we sometimes think about the Arctic only? Do we need to look more subnationally, regional to regional cooperation? Or what could be the creative solution to reach more young people, to help young people to reach policymakers, you know, on various levels, you know? Should we probably not talk about the Arctic all the time, but about different Arctics and maybe focus more on that kind of perspective when trying to involve young people and you know, making the world understand that the Arctic is a complex place?
I could start. I didn't mention that we work very much through the northern sparsely populated area network in Brussels. And we have created a new slogan, Space for Life. And that doesn't just mean that you have space, but you're not only, you could say, moving to a place to survive, you are there to live. And that's a very good way of starting. But I think you need to create creative environments, and as you mentioned, for example, in Indigenous, in the north east part, the easternmost point of Norway. They have, if you say, the old hospital has now become rather large, very innovative place where you can come and stay for a year, 3 months. You have a very young, creative environment with startups from almost all over the world. You can come there and try out the way of living if you like it. It's a good starting point, but they also start to get a political voice because this creates a model for how younger people want to work, live. They are not interested in maybe a 10, 12-hour day working. They want to have some leisure time and a place to do that in a safe way. So it's, of course, just a very good example on how. I don't know if it answered the question about youth involvement in politics, but I think that's very, you could say, interest-driven, and you have to listen, you have to show trust, and you have to be willing to find other creative solutions than the ordinary political solutions that always come on the table after negotiations, but involve them, find a good solution for them, because politics is finding good solutions on problems. So, and they can be done in many ways. Yeah.
I'm going to say yes and. So absolutely. I think there's a couple of things that I would like to see more of and can point to a couple of things. The first is that through an EU project, which you're very familiar with, Andreas, we have the ability to create this network of cities through the Arctic Urban and Regional Cooperation Project of the EU. It's innovative in that it includes not just the European Arctic, but also the North American Arctic, which is great, because then we can talk about how the problems are, everyone has a housing problem, but the solution is different. I think that is incredibly valuable because it allows for not only problems, but for solutions to be shared. So that's really excellent that the EU is stretching its Arctic policy to include the entire Arctic. The other thing is that in our mentorship program, which is also part of an EU youth project, we have to have young people from Europe as well. So we have some European youth, some Arctic youth. We have Arctic leaders, and I love this olders thing, this olders and elders from the Arctic, but they're not all working in the Arctic all the time either. Some of them are in academia. Kirsti Methi works down in Brussels, but from Tromsø. And I think those kinds of experiences of bridging geographies and also really having opportunities to share what's actually happening in our communities is really, really powerful. And I would just, leave with this thought that we have to support these things. They have to be sustainable. We can't always just be chasing the next funding call. We need to call on our decision makers to invest in the tried and true Arctic stakeholders that are delivering and doing their job in the Arctic. So
come back to the long-term thinking.
And I would say that there is there's definitely a space for making connections with people in the South to learn about innovations. I'm part of a UArctic thematic network on teacher education, and so we've published a couple of books and many projects and a lot of understanding in the circumpolar north, but we also now are part of a UNESCO unit WIN North-South. So we're talking with people from Australia, New Zealand, Mozambique, Ethiopia. There's lessons to be learned from other remote places and different solutions. I also think in Alaska, so many indigenous innovations have been in part spurred by our relationship with Maori people, because things like language nests, things like saying there's no reason why you shouldn't have 500 indigenous PhDs, that came from our friends in the South who came up and said, you can do this. We've done this, you can do this. And it wasn't that the models have to be exactly the same, but it's that sense. So I do think there are places where we keep this circumpolar, this Arctic identity, but we bring that with us and interact with other global communities. And that allows us to, because there's also things that we do better in the Arctic that are really valuable to share. And so it's really, how do we make sure that we're enabling those opportunities? And that's for policymakers as much as for youth. And particularly when I think about local community development, energy, that we take people from remote northern places who have certain kinds of microgrid expertise and get them into Africa that has other kinds of microgrid expertise. There's a lot of really powerful cross-pollination with that.
I think, thank you very much for that last thought, because I think that we cannot overemphasize, that of course there's knowledge, we have to share it, but you have to keep on sharing it and keep on funding it. You have to, this long-term thinking and, this, you shouldn't stop, after a while. You have to, and maybe also think outside the box, where are the peripheries? And you also talk about the sparsely populated areas and other peripheries we can learn from, and they can learn from us. So thank you very much, Niels, Patty, and Diane, for having joined me here for the second Arctic Frontiers Offstage session at Arctic Frontiers 2025. We'll have a couple of more of those, and I hope you join us next year in person in Tromsø after watching us.